What exactly is a seven-headed dragon? Multiple cultures around the world have adopted their own version of a seven-headed serpent or a seven-headed dragon. This has happened dozens of times throughout human history. Often this symbolism is used to represent a benevolent deity, a universal law, or even a spiritual principle. In Indian and Cambodian Hinduism, for example, their god Vishnu is usually associated with the snake named Shisha, usually depicted as a seven-headed snake. Shisha is a primordial demigod of creation who is said to hold the planets of the universe in his hoods while constantly singing the glories of Vishnu. In Buddhism as well, in one of his stories, one of the Buddhas is protected by the king of serpents during a terrible storm, and this king of serpents also has 7 heads. However, several of these seven-headed serpents or dragons are also considered to be malevolent, like the seven-headed dragon from the Book of Revelation. It's a total mystery how so many cultures around the world have independently created their own version of a multi-headed serpent or dragon completely separately from each other, with entire oceans or continents dividing these cultures, as well as hundreds, if not thousands of years separating the myths and legends of these cultures. That's why some people believe that there must be some sort of a connection between these beliefs. Maybe this concept comes from a really early time in human history and it evolved as humanity migrated across the earth. My belief is that most stories about the gods are actually describing celestial events or even astrological movements. Our ancestors personified these events as a way to make sense of them and to connect those events to the things that humanity and the earth were going through during those times. Ancient people didn't often consider the events of the gods to be happening here on Earth. Instead, most of those stories are supposed to be playing out in the heavens. I think that even things like the story of Hercules can be linked to the sun's movement through the skies as it's traveling through all the constellations of the zodiac. Remember that Hercules too even fought an evil multi-headed serpent creature called the Hydra. Most of my life I've wondered if this multi-headed serpent concept wasn't always associated with apocalyptic imagery. I don't think that it's a coincidence that the Book of Revelation also evokes the same multi-headed serpent concept in their description of the end times. It appears as if this multi-headed dragon is something that our ancestors feared, and maybe something that they wanted us to look for. So what exactly is the seven-headed serpent, and why do so many ancient cultures have a representation of this concept? In the Book of Revelation, we're introduced to the concept of a seven-headed dragon with 7 crowns and 10 horns. There are a few different ways that this has been interpreted by theologians and scholars. Perhaps this even has multiple layers of meaning to it. Some believe that the seven-headed dragon represents Rome, the city with 7 hills, with the dragon itself representing the evil actions of Rome as well as their rebellion against God. Perhaps Revelation was using this imagery of a vicious beast to describe Rome's power, as well as the evil things they were willing to do to maintain their power and control within their empire. Rome infamously conquered a multitude of cultures within their empire, erasing their histories and assuming control of their religions. Rome's control structure was made central to the belief system of every culture within their empire. But it's likely that the dragon doesn't represent Rome. Later in the story, the Book of Revelation makes it clear that this seven-headed red dragon is the one that we call the devil or Satan, the same agent who tricked Adam and Eve and subverted God's plans for them and the rest of humanity. Revelation says that the dragon's tail made up 1/3 of the stars in the heavens, which he cast down to the earth, which represents the legion of fallen angels who followed Satan and corrupted the earth. Revelation also says that this dragon stood against a woman who was ready to give birth to a man-child who was destined to rule the earth with an iron rod, a child that Satan wanted to defeat. But then God took that child into heaven. Many consider this man-child to be Jesus. But that's the literal interpretation of the words. If this dragon is Satan, the leader of the rebellion against God, then his 7 heads with 7 crowns must represent the power that Satan has over 7 separate kingdoms that have worshipped him and followed him throughout history, which would mean that Rome would be only one of these 7 kingdoms. This is all very interesting poetry, and I'm sure that it is meant to resemble some of the things that are happening on Earth. But like I said, my belief is that most stories about gods are actually representing celestial events. The truth is that this dragon in Revelation is much more likely representative of a serpent constellation in the northern hemisphere known as Draco, in one of the highest parts of the heavens right near the northern star, so high up that a part of Draco is always visible in the night sky all year long. Draco never descends below the horizon. The serpent Draco runs between the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper, and the constellation Hercules stands right on top of his head. What's really interesting though is that part of the Draco constellation used to be the old northern star, the central pivot point for our night sky. But 5,000 years ago, the Earth's axis shifted, turning Polaris into our modern northern star. So if you understand the poetry here, our ancestors 5,000 years ago likely created the legend of Satan being cast out of the highest part of heaven when they noticed that our night sky had shifted, making it so that Draco was no longer at the highest point of the night sky. Wild, right? And maybe this even happened during some sort of a natural disaster. This might even explain why so many ancient cultures shifted from venerating the snake as an important deity to fearing the serpent as an evil adversary. This is also probably why the entity that tricked Adam and Eve into eating the fruit was considered a serpent. One of the oldest depictions of a 7-headed dragon comes from the ancient Sumerians from around 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, with their monster known as the Musang 7, which roughly translates to 7-headed serpent. In their legend, this dragon was defeated by the god Minerva, who was known as a warrior and a hunter. Minerva was often depicted with a sickle sword, a bow and arrow, and a talking mace named Shaurur. In his story, Minerva had to defeat 7 separate monsters in order to gain innovations and magical items. The Sumerians were obsessed with the number 7, which is why we actually have 7 days in the week, and it's also probably why the number 7 is considered the number of completion. There's a possibility that the Sumerian legend is where this 7-headed dragon motif originates from, but there is one candidate that's a little bit older that we're gonna get to later. Either way, this Sumerian legend clearly influenced several stories that came from multiple cultures that came later, and that might even include the Bible, because some scholars believe that the god Ninurta shows up in the Old Testament as Nimrod. There's also an ancient seal that was unearthed in Tel Hazar. It might be either Phoenician or Israelite, nobody really knows for sure, and it depicts the hero Hathor defeating a 7-headed serpent. This seal is wild because the art almost looks Sumerian. It includes an Egyptian scarab in Ankh, along with a winged cobra, a griffin, and 2 monkeys for some reason. And they believe that this seal was carved sometime in the 7th or 8th century BC, meaning that this Sumerian legend had survived in the Middle East and Mesopotamia for several thousand years. And it also very clearly demonstrates how the Sumerian belief system had influenced the early Abrahamic religion. The wildest part about this seal is the resemblance between the hero Hathor and the Greek hero Hercules fighting the Hydra. I mean, look, they're even depicted in the exact same pose with one arm over their head and one arm reaching out towards the serpent. As I described in my video, Jesus and the Apocalypse, I believe that this particular pose is associated with the constellation Orion, as well as the constellation Hercules, which is basically a miniature version of Orion. For some reason, multiple ancient cultures considered Orion and Hercules to be representations of a hero in the sky, and they featured them heavily in their myths and legends. Like I said at the beginning of the video, the constellation Hercules is basically standing on the head of the constellation Draco. Even Zeus has been depicted as Orion fighting a multi-tailed monster, and Gilgamesh was also depicted as fighting a dragon in the same hero pose. Even the Akkadians had their own version of this myth that appeared about about 4,200 years ago. They created a cylinder seal depicting two gods and their helpers battling a fiery dragon with 7 heads. I don't know exactly the story behind this seal, but clearly the gods are winning this battle as the monster only has 3 heads left. Again, this is very similar to the story of Hercules, as in some versions of the legend, Hercules has help fighting the Hydra, often depicted battling alongside the warrior Iolaus. Now, we can at least make some tenuous connections between these different versions of heroes fighting different versions of multi-headed serpents, because we can tie some of these cultures together through different migrations and conquests throughout history. However, we still see multi-headed and 7-headed serpents popping up in areas that should have been completely isolated from the Sumerian concept of the 7-headed dragon. In Mexico, for example, we find Chicomacoatl. She is the goddess of agriculture and fertility, as well as nourishment and human livelihood. Basically, the goddess of food and drink, or sustenance. Chicomacoatl roughly translates into 7 serpent, and though she had a human form, she was sometimes depicted with 7 snake heads. The serpent was a common theme among Mexican religions, believed to represent fertility and transformation. This figure looks an awful lot like Vishnu, but what's really interesting is that the Hindu tradition also had their own fertility goddess linked to health and prosperity as well, Manasa. She is also often depicted with a 7-headed snake behind her. The fertility goddess Manasa and the fertility goddess Chicomacoatl are eerily similar for 2 goddesses that were born on opposite sides of an ocean in 2 cultures that had never met or had any crossover. How is this possible? Chicomacoatl is also sometimes depicted as sitting on almost like a throne of snakes. Again, 7 heads, but this time they're pointing down towards the earth. Here, the serpents could be seen as depicting something like sun rays coming down from the heavens and supplying the earth or supplying their agriculture with nourishment. And the most mysterious depiction of a 7-headed figure that I've found comes from Siberia, where an ancient petroglyph was found in modern-day Caucasia, believed to be around 7,000 years old. Perhaps the oldest depiction of a 7-headed figure that we have on record. Now, obviously this probably isn't a dragon, and there's no way of knowing if these are supposed to represent serpent heads. But perhaps if the other depictions of multi-headed serpents or dragons are based off of some kind of celestial event or something that our ancestors saw in the heavens, then it's possible that this petroglyph is also depicting that exact same thing, whatever it was. And this petroglyph is almost certainly a religious symbol. To the right of the figure, the artists have depicted what archaeologists believe to be the world tree, an ancient concept that has existed in multiple cultures from around the world. The world tree connects the heavens to the earth and the earth to the underworld. Believe it or not, in multiple cultures, it's actually the serpent that represents this concept of connecting the living world to the underworld. By including the world tree in this petroglyph, the artists are almost certainly communicating to us that this is supposed to represent some sort of a celestial or heavenly event, or at very least a deity. There's also a sun wheel to the right of the figure, which multiple cultures throughout history have used to depict either the 4 seasons or at least the sun's movements through the heavens. So this is a pretty good indication that whoever made this was an agricultural culture. And this image also includes 7 smaller people who are probably normal-sized humans that might be observing this figure in the heavens or in the sky above them. But 3 of these figures are between her legs, so there's also a really good chance that she too is some sort of a fertility goddess depicted as giving birth to these people beneath her. So this could basically be the exact same thing as the fertility goddess from the Aztec culture, Chicomacoatl. This petroglyph might actually be depicting the exact same thing from the Hindu culture, Manasa. So then the question is, what the hell is this thing doing across another ocean and across a giant continent from Chicomacoatl? Do you think that it might be possible that our ancient ancestors had created this deity sometime in the early Neolithic era when agriculture was being developed and starting to evolve? And somehow these cultures are distantly related through early human migration through Asia and the Americas? space. This theory is sketchy, I know, but religious artifacts like this are actually our best indication that there might be some sort of a connection between the Siberians, Southeast Asians, and Middle Americans. Maybe all of these cultures have a distant ancient commonality. Maybe they all came from the same place. This petroglyph also really reminds me of the squatting man image. Again, I did an entire video on the squatting man, the image of God revealed. There's a lot about this seven-headed giant image that indicates that there's a group of people watching this image in the heavens above them. But this image is also very distinct from any other image of the squatting man that I've ever seen. This might be something different. This is a lot more like those Mesopotamian dragons that I showed you before. What the hell is this thing? Again, it's 7,000 years old. So the real question is, does this thing have anything to do with the seven-headed dragons that we find in the Middle East and Mesopotamia? Maybe. Maybe not. If this same seven-headed figure was seen in the heavens or seen in space by our ancestors, it's possible that they all interpreted it in different ways, and then this figure evolved in different ways throughout the millennia. Some seeing it as serpents, some seeing it as a dragon, some seeing it as a benevolent figure that brings fertility, and some seeing it as a malevolent figure that brings destruction. I guess it all depends on the context of the events when this thing was visible in space. It might all depend on what was actually happening in each individual region when they could see this thing. The imagery described in Revelation is especially confusing because it mixes a bunch of concepts that exist throughout the entire Bible. Satan being described as a seven-headed dragon, for example, is very confusing, especially when you consider that he also meets another seven-headed figure at some point in the story, a beast that rises out of the sea. And this beast also has 10 horns. And this seven-headed beast is actually described in a very similar way to the four beasts described in Daniel 7, as if they're all combined into a single evil creature. The beasts described in Daniel 7 were all meant to be separate kingdoms that would come at some point and persecute the followers of God. So it's safe to assume that this seven-headed beast in Revelation represents these same exact kingdoms. So I think that if the dragon of Revelation represents Satan's heavenly power, then I think that the seven-headed beast of Revelation represents his actual power structure, the literal kingdoms on earth that follow Satan. And the seven heads represent seven different empires that have existed throughout history. It says that 5 of the heads were, 1 head is, and 1 head is yet to come. So the 5 empires that were would have been the 5 historical empires that persecuted the followers of God, like Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. The 1 head that is would have been the head that existed at the time that Revelation was written, Rome. And the 1 head that is yet to come, well, that empire might not have actually revealed itself yet. Maybe. I just wanted to take a second to thank my patrons and my channel members for supporting my videos. I could not do this without you. I love you guys. You're amazing. Anyways, there are several other multi-headed serpents and dragons that have popped up across the world. They don't all have exactly 7 heads. In Japan, there's the legend of Yamata no Orochi, an 8-headed dragon. This story is cool as hell. And again, there's the Greek Hydra, which was defeated by Hercules, and the Hydra is usually depicted with 9 heads. Then there's Zmi, who is a Slavic dragon, usually depicted with 3 heads. And then there's Azdaya, which was another 3-headed dragon that's also from the Baltic region. And then there was Dahaka, who was like a demon, snake, dragon thing from Persian mythology, originally from the Zoroastrian culture. Also had 3 heads. Most people don't realize this, but the Bible actually has another 7-headed serpent dragon creature that's completely separate from the dragon of Revelation. In the Old Testament, they talk about a creature known as the Leviathan, which was some sort of a beast that God created to play in the Mediterranean Sea. And then later in the story, God confronted and defeated the Leviathan, overcoming it, and then feeding its remains to the creatures of the desert. Now, I know that that everyone always depicts the Leviathan as having a single head, but this is actually inaccurate. In fact, Psalm 74:14 makes it clear that the Leviathan had multiple heads when it says that God broke the heads of the Leviathan. Heads plural. Now, Psalms doesn't make it clear exactly how many heads the Leviathan had. It just said that there's heads plural. But according to the Canaanites, the Leviathan had 7 heads and it was defeated by Baal. Man, what a crazy subject for a video. I would love to know what you think. Are multi-headed dragons some sort of a bizarre leftover from our ancient ancestors that we've somehow maintained a cultural memory of throughout the millennia? Were dragons a real thing, and the only way we have left to remember them is through myths and legends? Or were dragons actually representative of celestial events, like comets, plasma events, or things that happened in the heavens above us that our ancestors struggled to understand? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching.